Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respected families, wherever you're located on this God's green earth. On this first episode of Real Talks with Amini, I'm honored to have Lieutenant Colonel Shane Fite, a former U.S. Army officer, with us today to discuss about the situation in Afghanistan. He has served the U.S. government and American people for more than 3 decades in the U.S. Army, and he has visited Afghanistan and served in Afghanistan alongside Afghan security forces in the battle against terrorism. So we'll hear from him about his experiences, about his viewpoints, how he sees the situation today, the suffering of the people, and the crisis that's going on in Afghanistan, and how he feels about it, and how does he think that there could be a solution to the crisis in Afghanistan. So with that, Shane, welcome to the program. Glad to have you. Thank you for your time and for giving us this opportunity to interview you, to speak with you, to have your views. Maybe you can start by briefly talking about your visits to Afghanistan. When did you go to Afghanistan, and in what capacities did you serve, and how did you find Afghanistan when you were there?
Thank you, Sadiq. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you again. I was reflecting earlier as I was getting ready for this that we've already known each other over a dozen years, and that's pretty amazing in and of itself. I did spend a little time over in Afghanistan. I'm going to admit up front, it probably wasn't the most wonderful time of my life, although I found Afghanistan itself to be a fascinating place. I flew all over Afghanistan. I went to Mazar-e-Sharif up in the north. I went to, I was in Kandahar. I spent some time at Bagram. Spent a little time in Kabul itself. Went to the embassy there. And of course, we were doing military operations. I was in a logistics command, and I found the experience to be fascinating. Long way from home, obviously, but a great place. I saw some things that were amazing in and of themselves. I remember that there was a regular market, where Afghan vendors would come in, and it was fascinating to see the men, their sons, and frankly, they looked like a happy people, and it was so being in service and trying to do something to help the situation in Afghanistan as it was unfolding was something that I was proud to do. Then I spent some time in Kuwait a few years later, and then retired shortly after that. And I've been an observer since then.
Yeah. And how did you feel about the collapse of the Afghanistan's republic and the total withdrawal of the U.S. and coalition forces from Afghanistan in August 15? You know, you helped build the Afghan security sector, basically, and all of the institutions that were fighting terrorism, all of the counterterrorism capabilities that were there in Afghanistan. It was all based on your efforts and the efforts of your colleagues, with the money and the taxpayers' money from the Americans, and all of them being lost, and all of them being fallen back in the hands of a group that is a terrorist group, the Taliban, who had facilitated and had helped Al Qaeda to attack the United States in the first place, and all of them back being in control, and Al Qaeda coming back to Afghanistan. How did you feel about that?
I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Sadiq. It was a stake to the heart, and I did have a few days after that occurred, that withdrawal, which in my opinion was totally botched, and we frankly we betrayed some of our coalition partners. There was not a very good plan. There was not very good communication. And I'm talking about from a military standpoint. It was wrong in so many ways And then, of course, the blame game started. The administration that was conducting the withdrawal blamed the previous administration, saying that, well, this was their plan. It wasn't. The plan was event-based and not time-based, and the current administration made it time-based instead. It was doomed to failure once that parameter occurred. And so you ended up with expended treasure from Afghans, from the United States, from over 20 coalition partners that was wasted, in all honesty. And I still remember the elections that occurred in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and how proud the people were to be able to do those votes, and how, in fact, there was joy, there was happiness in the opportunities that some of these countries in Southwest Asia and the Middle East were getting to do some things for the first time, in some cases in decades. So I was unhappy. It was an expenditure of treasure with no positive result, with no outcome, with no goal met, and that can be unbelievably frustrating.
Yeah, I can imagine. And on top of that, losing access to important strategic bases like Bagram and Shendan airfield, or Kandahar base. On top of it, democracy being lost.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt. Yeah. I mean, Diego Garcia is pretty much all we have left there. The partnership that was building with the Afghan people, and I'll even extend it to Ukraine. We could build a good partnership there as well that would actually keep wars from happening instead of starting them up again. And I was a soldier for 36 years, Sadiq, but I am not pro-war. War is a last event, last result, and it always breaks things and destroys people. So, okay, I trained for it, but that doesn't mean that I like it, and I certainly don't want to see it if there's any other way possible. And I believe there is another way possible.
And the fact that, the U.S. Withdrawal basically allowed or signaled to the Russians, to the Putin, that they could do anything they want. And, the idea was to withdraw, to get out of conflict. But since the withdrawal, conflicts have happened throughout the world, from Europe to Middle East. We were seeing how authoritarian states, along with terrorist regimes, are becoming emboldened with that a retreat, basically, that the U.S. did from Afghanistan, and you see the connection there as well.
Well, you're absolutely right. First of all, Putin is not an idiot by any stretch of the imagination. He's a political animal. He is a survivor. I'm not even going to call Putin evil, but he is an opportunist, and he will take advantage of situations that he believes are in the best interest of either his country or himself personally. And I believe that's what he did with Afghanistan, and the result there. That certainly emboldened him to do more and stay harder and stay longer in Ukraine. I believe that if Afghanistan had been handled properly, that things would have ended with what President Obama gave up with the Crimea and the Donbass and in Ukraine. And it appeasing people like Putin just leads to bad things. There's really no other way to put that.
Yeah. And how do you assess the governance of the Taliban in the past 3.5 years? Almost, there was a narrative that was being shaped during the negotiations and afterwards that the Taliban have changed, that this is Taliban 2.0, that they will cut off their ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. But, what we're seeing on the ground is completely the same Taliban as they were in the 1990s, and the same Al-Qaeda operatives and other terrorist groups being back in Afghanistan. And on top of it now, the Taliban regime is basically a puppet government in the hands of the IRGC of Iran and the Pakistani inter-service intelligence, and through them, at the strategic level, they are at the service of the China's Communist Party, and the Russia's Putin. What do you see? What do you hear about the situation on the ground?
It's amazing. I'm one of those guys who gives props where they are earned, even though I don't like it. I got to give Iran credit. They have created a proxy group that is frankly quite amazing. And the fact that we helped to enable that with the release of cash and reserves to them makes me frankly even angrier. It was wrong on so many levels. And there is zero doubt in my mind that besides Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and in Yemen and so forth, that they definitely have ties with Al-Qaeda, with the Taliban. They create agitation in the eastern area of Ukraine. They have far-reaching tentacles, and frankly, they're quite good at it. And they need to be stopped. And we need to contain Iran, and we need to contain their proxy network, and we need to cut off those tentacles as soon as we possibly can. And why this current administration in the United States didn't see that it's unintelligible to me. I do not know why they could not figure that part out and why they couldn't work to break those networks the way that they needed to be broken for world peace.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Taliban, the way they are governing right now, it's the same as they were governing in the past. More than 20 million Afghan women and girls are practically in prison. They've lost their basic rights to education, to university, to work, to even get out of their houses or choose their own clothing, what type of clothes they want to wear. And more than 40 million Afghans are basically now have lost their political identity. There's no state to represent them. There's no diplomatic representatives on their behalf to represent them. There's no government. There's no legitimacy. There's no Afghan flag. So basically, it's like a chaotic situation that has been created. How do you and your colleagues feel about that? That when you went in, it wasn't just Al-Qaeda getting the Al-Qaeda out, but it was also bringing freedom to Afghans. That democracy, freedom, and women's rights were major achievements of the Bush administration when they went into Afghanistan, and all of it being lost and being back to zero. How do you guys feel about it?
Well, that was the first part of your previous question, and it may sound a little strange coming from a lifelong infantryman, and it may sound a little strange coming from a lifelong conservative as well. But suppressing women suppresses the talents and capabilities of half our population. There's no reason to do it. There is no right way to do it. There is no way that any country should be anything but ostracized for doing it. And I have heard the arguments about from even some people in Afghanistan. Well, this is the way we protect our women. I'm sorry, that's not the way it happens. I remember driving through Kabul one day and seeing women out and about. Some of them dressed very conservatively according to culture and tradition and religious mores of the time, but some of them in Western dress as well. And everybody seemed to be getting along just fine back in 2012 while I was driving through there. And then the Taliban came in and said they weren't going to do it and did it anyway. And women are locked back down completely. It's extremely difficult for any of them to be in any professions. I mean, think of all the doctors alone that were taken away from the population. It's criminal in its result. And I don't want to mess with anybody else's culture. That's their business. That's what they should have. This goes well beyond culture, Sadiq. This goes to actual suppression of the human spirit. And I can't condone it under any circumstances. And you probably saw in our own election here in the last couple of weeks how the subject of women became a central part of the entire thing. Well, I'm not going to get into, what's important to women, what's not important to women, but I do believe that the protection of the rights of women is just as important as the protection of the rights of any other group that exists on the planet.
Absolutely, absolutely. And since you talked about election, maybe we can briefly give your perspective about how the issue of Afghanistan had become one of the topics of the debate between the two sides, and it appeared that the Republican Party had the upper hand in those arguments with respect to the situation in Afghanistan. Do you think that had an impact in terms of the voters voting one way or another?
Remember that President Biden said that there would be no boots on the ground. And sure enough, when the opportunity came to have a boot on the ground with the pier that was built in the to try to supply Hamas with humanitarian aid, and sure enough, a U.S. soldier dies trying to implement that pier. Well, that's boots on the ground, and that's U.S. soldiers again dying for wars and involvement that should not be happening. And I found that the entire thing here and the way that it's going to affect Afghanistan is kind of fascinating, because think about what happened in Dearborn, Michigan, which has a very large Arab and Muslim population. And they shifted hugely over to voting for Trump. Now, you're talking about Arab Americans, Muslim Americans voting for a man who has had Benjamin Netanyahu in his home fairly recently and has been a staunch advocate of Israel, has moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And of course, everybody who was against him doing that thought that that was going to be a conflagration in and of itself. It turned out not to be. But you're also talking about a man who came up with 3 Abraham Accords, who came up with a way to look for and to create situations for peace. And I think that what Arab Americans showed to the team that they were previously on was, wait a minute, we are actually for peace. We're not for the terrorist organizations, the 3%, the 5%, the 10% of our countries. We are actually for peace, and that is what is going to be the most important to us going forward. If you take that into account for places like the Ukraine and for Israel and Lebanon and the Gaza Strip, the same thing applies to Afghanistan. And there are important reasons to have the breadbasket of Asia be in good stead with the West. And I believe that the next administration is going to have a much better way of leading us into that, and understanding that that part of Asia, all the way from Georgia, Afghanistan to Ukraine, is going to be the way forward for the United States and Western allies in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's critical, given the situation that is right now happening in the world, where the countries like China and Russia, and along, of course, with Iranians, are becoming much more aggressive on various fronts. So it will be interesting to see what the next administration, their response will be in this new way of competition or conflict that is happening. Of course, the expectation is that the conflicts would be addressed through dialogue and negotiation, but how much the other side is willing to negotiate and speak.
Well, you're absolutely right. And those coalitions are important for that reason. You mentioned Russia, you mentioned China, North Korea is also in that mix, and you've already talked about the situation in Iraq. Or in Iran. The way to keep the security of America strong, the way to keep the security of the West strong, is to build those coalitions and put walls around those folks. We need to do the same thing with India, by the way. India and Afghanistan and Ukraine and Georgia, if we can make any inroads there, are all important for the same reasons.
Yeah. And how did you see the veterans' role in the election, in the U.S. election? So I observed a number of them being very active. There were a lot of candidates this time, and they were very actively campaigning the election period. So do you think their perspectives had an impact and their efforts had an impact on the outcome of the election?
There are few people who understand and hate war as much as the person who has been there. And so, yes, without a shadow of a doubt, the perspective of veterans who won and also some veterans who lost in very close races has definitely done something to shift our mode of thinking. Veterans are not afraid to go to war. It's just that we don't want to unless there's a really good reason. And I think that they were able to convince the electorate this time of that fact. I believe that that is a goal. I believe that that is a mindset that is going to go forward ever stronger in election cycles as we move forward. And this was an important one in that area. Veterans clearly have a key role in making that tide continue to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we also observed in our community, the Afghan American community, comparatively, the number of voters this time was higher than the previous elections. And also, it was interesting that majority of them voted Republican this time. Unlike the previous elections, where they would mostly vote with Democrats, this time around they were more interested in the Republican program than the Democrats, because the way the Democrats handled the evacuation and the way they went to zero, as you earlier stated, the conditions were removed from negotiating with the Taliban or intra-Afghan negotiation that was supposed to happen, and also the program to keep the U.S. Embassy open, to keep 2,500 forces at least on the ground. That all of those programs were canceled, and unilaterally the U.S. and coalition forces withdrew, and the impact that had on the country. And also, Afghans observed how the candidate, which was for the president, who was vice president, had never mentioned Afghanistan once during the whole period of 4 years that they were in charge. And so I think that those factors had a role to play. But they also have an expectation from the Republican Party now that they're running the system to change the policy. Do you see that change coming towards Afghanistan?
Well, I believe absolutely that is going to happen. And it's interesting that you talk about Afghan Americans voting. You know as well as anybody that there's a time requirement to become a Afghan American citizen. And in order to get those voting rights and other things like that, that time is happening. And I look forward to you yourself being one of those Afghan American citizens. And I found that the experience of Afghans going through, in some cases, many war periods, even back to when, for older Afghans, even back to when the Russians were in Afghanistan and having to fight their way out of that. And I believe that Afghans are tired of their country being used as a ping pong ball. I can understand why that would be the case. But again, for the West, creating, think of it as what the Democrats call the blue wall with those northern states, creating that South Asia wall in order to encapsulate Russia and China is the way to enhance the security of us all. And that is what I think needs to be done. I believe that Trump, who, by the way, wanted to get out of Afghanistan, he wanted to end the endless wars. And I believe that he was right to do so. But he had a plan to make it happen. And he wanted to leave Afghanistan secure and a partner. And when you turn that into a time function instead of an event function, that's not going to happen. And of course, we all know now that's exactly what did happen with the current administration.
Yeah. How do you assess the level of threats towards the U.S. homeland and U.S. interest in the region since the withdrawal and since the Taliban came back to power and all of the terrorist groups in terms of terrorism?
I believe there's two things at work here. There is physical terrorism and there is cyber terrorism. the more that North Korea and China and Russia and Iran can do to farm out their physical terrorism goals, the more time that they have to work on cyber terrorism. And physically, terrorism to the United States, at least, or to the Western Hemisphere, is not that huge a deal because it's kind of difficult to get in. But cyber terrorism, on the other hand, is a monstrous deal. And when you give the Russians and the Chinese especially, but yes, even the Iranians and the North Koreans, an opportunity to build those cyber terrorist networks, to create those inroads into the computer systems of other countries, it is a huge, huge threat. And frankly, we're behind. I don't like it, but we are behind.
Yeah, yeah. But even comparatively, if you look at the period before the 2021 and then the period afterwards, you see a lot more number of attacks by ISIS-K in Europe, and also
Yes.
we have heard infiltration of ISIS-K members in the United States. That it's very, the name is being used as ISIS-K, but you and I know that they are all Taliban. That they're all believing in the same ideology, with the same perspectives and same fundamentalism and extremists, and how they're inclined in attacking the Western civilization at any chance that they get. Those numbers have spiked, right?
Well, I certainly didn't say there's no threat.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that it's harder for them to do physical terrorism activities across to the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's obviously happened. I mean, 9/11 is a perfect example, and there have been not tens but hundreds of these incidents that have gone on. Everything from the original Trade Center bombing to lots of things going on, especially in religious circles and with churches, mosques, Jewish centers of worship. It certainly is a problem, but the one that scares me the most is the cyber terrorism. Now, I will also give one caveat. The last 4 years of allowing well over 12, 15 million people to come across the border almost unfettered. And remember, I live down here on the border. Okay. I literally can drive down the street and see it. I can see the people in city parks and on the streets of Brownsville and on the streets of McAllen. And non-governmental organizations try as hard as they can to provide services to folks who have been allowed to be released into the United States and then make ongoing transportation arrangements and so forth. But I'm telling you, when you're talking about millions of people, finding a way to, number one, take care of all those people, but more importantly, doing the vetting necessary to enhance and create and maintain security is impossible to do right now. For that reason, while I am hugely pro-immigrant, and the United States has authorized more than 1 million immigrants per year for the last 30 consecutive years. Very important to know that. And of course, all you hear on the one side is, well, you're xenophobic. You are against immigration. No, I am not against immigration at all. I love vetted and sponsored immigration. I think it is absolutely the way to go. But that's not what we've been doing. We have been nowhere close to that. And so even though I believe that physical terrorism is not as big a deal right now for us as cyber terrorism, this last 4 years has certainly enhanced that problem and is something that we've got to fix. For that reason, I will admit, I am for deportation of people who arrived here illegally and have not been vetted.
Yeah, I think it's very important to look into the people who are unvetted, and also be very careful on how they're vetting people to come to the United States, given the level of threat that is out there from the authoritarian states and from terrorist states that are now aligned and working together. You could easily see that a terrorist state of the Taliban as an umbrella with all of the terrorist groups acting on the behest of the Chinese and the Russians and trying to hurt the U.S. and Western interests from their perspective in an asymmetric warfare, because they cannot face-to-face challenge the U.S. and Western forces, but using terrorism, of course, they could do, and they have done in the past. So I hope that the relevant entities would take a harder look on this recent incident where somebody was hired to assassinate President Trump, the ones who were working for IRGC of Iran. So hopefully those connections were they need to seriously look into it, whether it's just IRGC or whether the Chinese are involved, the Russians are involved. You think that seriousness and commitment is there within the institutions to do so?
Well, I like the fact that you mentioned asymmetric warfare. I will tell you right now that the Western Hemisphere still does not understand the asymmetric nature of today's warfare and today's theaters of conflict. It's unfortunate, but they don't get it. Even Europe has a hard time with the idea of asymmetric warfare, and part of it, of course, is the experiences. I mean, even now in the United States, granddad or great granddad having been in World War II, and forces moving across the plains in Europe, and all the way up through Vietnam, and even conflicts like the invasion of Panama. It's still force on force. Western societies do not understand asymmetry of warfare the way that terrorist organizations do. And we've got to become smarter at it, and we've got to do a better job of educating our total populace on exactly what can happen, what those dangers are, and what our part is in it to keep it from occurring.
Yeah. And I was glad that they detected a program or a plan of attack on the election day. That there was a guy arrested with their accomplices. So hopefully the relevant institutions are vigilant, but we cannot just always be looking inside and internally to prevent an attack. We need to look outside and to see where are these attacks are being originated, where are the plans being prepared. Is it just the Taliban leadership? Or is it just mullahs of Iran, or is it just some sophisticated, collaborative, concerted effort by an axis of evil, basically that are planning to take down the U.S. and Western civilization down? It's not an easy time in this world, given the fact that the axis of evil are determined to basically take down this international system that has been built and managed by the West for so long, that has been a source of stability and security, that they're trying to change it for whatever replacement. They have no idea, trying to replace the US dollar, or trying to make sure the US forces are being ejected from various corners of the world. But how would that affect the world security? I think hopefully the relevant entities are much more vigilant with the new administration coming in to take a harder look on where are we in terms of these threats and these enemies. What are they doing actually? Is it just Ukraine, or they're cooking something up, preparing something big, and hopefully they're looking into these things.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Our three-letter agencies, grew up fighting the KGB and fighting Chinese intelligence and so forth. And I believe that it's still a learning process to understand terrorist networking and the organizations behind them. It's frankly a relatively recent understanding, at least on the part of American people, about the proxy terrorist network that Iran has been able to create. And if Iran can do it, for a fact that the Chinese and the Russians can do it. The Russian intelligence organization has been the cream of the crop for at least 150 years. So we have to do a better job. Instead of just force on force, instead of just whatever replace the KGB and the CIA fighting each other on a regular basis, these terrorist networks are the way that we need to go in order to understand our security structure for this present world.
Yeah. Yeah, and something that is really interesting that has come up recently is a new terrorist group called ISIS-K or Daesh in Afghanistan. That all of the relevant entities when we were there, the U.S. government and Afghan forces, they knew that this was a made-up entity. But sometimes I think people in the West, those who are in think tanks or academia or other places, they try to see complexity in these things. Well, they look complex. They are not as complex as you would think if you look at them closely. Because since the ISIS-K has been created, it has basically served as a good cop, bad cop with the Taliban to make the Taliban look good compared to a more evil group that has been created. And so that paved the way for negotiations, that paved the way for engagement from the region, from the West. And since the engagement, the threat of ISIS-K has increased significantly, because the more ISIS-K attacks the region and creates problems in the world, the more it seems the region and the world feel like the Taliban could be a counterpart that they could work with to counter ISIS-K. Well, they are the ones who are creating it in the first place. How do you see these terrorist groups having different names and umbrellas, but serving the same purpose?
Yeah. Again, we have to understand the nimble nature, the flexibility that these terrorist organizations have developed. And I'm not saying it's magic. I'm not saying that it's things that cannot be figured out. What I'm saying is that we have to have a different mindset to do it. Frankly, we could follow what the Mossad has shown and learned, and it would be much to our benefit to do so. Those folks seem to have figured at least part of this out. And I think that we could learn a lot from that. Now, forget the ideology. I'm just talking about the mechanics of understanding how these organizations work. And it would be in our best interest to learn some of those lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the attack that happened on October 7th, that should give serves as an example that yes, when we're talking the terrorist threat is no longer as serious as we think they are. October 7th indicated that they are as serious as we think they are. And the moment we look the other way, they are there and they're ready and they're violent, they're barbarics, and they come in and attack you in a way that you never expect. And this happened just next door to Israel, where they have significant level of surveillance and personnel dedicated to look into this tiny geography, and this happened. So now imagine, with lack of resources on the ground in Afghanistan and the over-reliance of the U.S. and coalition on this over horizon capability, and sometimes you wonder that what do these people think, that these terrorists are speaking with each other through social media or through technology, or these are the organizations run based on words of mouth and based on Havala systems, based on communication of person to person, and those are not the things that you can capture with technology. And so you can imagine the vacuum that has been created right now, and that we are not seeing what they're preparing, what they are making at the level of the kind of programs of attacks.
Well, I'm going to have to come up with a name for that Georgia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, India wall that I'm talking about. That's something that I'll have to figure out. But that is unbelievably important to us to be able to create that security structure that we're going to need. We must have a social presence, a media presence, a diplomatic presence, and a connection with all of those countries in order to create the security structure that we've got to have. It's just that simple.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So coming back to Afghanistan, what do you think, given the situation that is there right now, the people of Afghanistan had pinned their hopes that maybe there would be some sort of a negotiation, that they could resolve their differences through a negotiation. And we knew it before, but now it's proven that you cannot negotiate with terrorists. No matter how many times you negotiate with them, they are still terrorists. No matter how many times you negotiate with them to release your hostages, they still go and kidnap hostages and they take hostages. And they don't speak on any issues that are relevant to Afghans. So that route is no longer available for Afghans. And the other route is, of course, that some Afghans are insisting and are working on is the fighting, of course, the resistance. But there isn't much support on that front as well. And the only option left for Afghans is basically a people's uprising, a national uprising that the people of Afghanistan throughout the country could, organize and unite and rise up. What do you think could be a solution that Afghans could consider, or the U.S. administration could help Afghans towards it?
Well, two items here. First of all, it's unfortunate, and having spent time in Afghanistan, obviously it's of interest to me. But it's unfortunate that Ukraine, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and what's going on in the Gulf, and Gaza, they have sucked the air out of the room in terms of the foreign policy interests of the United States. Don't get me wrong, Sadiq. I'm not happy about saying that, but I think it's true. Now, how do we get some of that air back to where it needs to be for those other countries that I've talked about that's part of this wall? Because not only are we not paying as much attention to Afghanistan as we should, we're not paying as much attention to Kyrgyzstan, we're not paying as much attention to Pakistan, we're not developing the relationship with India that we should, we're making no attempt whatsoever with Georgia. So that air gets sucked out of the room, and you get people who are probably linear thinkers like me and cannot multitask, and that's a problem for Afghanistan. And I don't know exactly how to fix that from this standpoint. I certainly hope that there will be advocates, especially people like you, and with the intellect that you and your friends have, to be able to raise the issues in the coming administration. How to do that exactly, I'm going to admit to you, I don't know. I'm an old soldier, Sadiq, and it's going to take people smart like you to be able to figure out parts of that.
Absolutely. And we're trying.
Said that, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Having said that, you still have things that are going on in Afghanistan itself that a lot of people here don't understand. A lot of people in the United States still don't understand the tribal nature of large parts of Afghanistan and the differences between what goes on in the cities and what goes on in the country. You fly up over the Hindu Kush, especially at night, and you can see little villages and towns up there, and there's no electricity up there. People are living in those places the same way that they lived 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So the fighting that would be necessary if the people did rise up are not going to be any more fun than they were during the time when the Russians were there, or the time when the U.S. and its coalition partners were there. I don't want to see Afghanistan have to go through that again. How to keep from it? Again, I'll admit to you, Sadiq, I don't know. And the only thing I can tell you is the vast majority of the West still does not understand the socio-political structure of Afghanistan, especially with the old tribal coalitions and so forth that are still very strong there.
Yeah. You mentioned about the villages that do not have electricity, and the sad part is that Afghanistan is a very rich in terms of resources, underground resources worth of trillions of dollars in that geography, and tapped resources from all types of raw materials and very valuable resources that are needed in the advanced societies. That if Afghans could have the necessary government in place that is representative of the people's interests, and is a sort of a stability that they could take out these resources to the benefit of Afghanistan and to the benefits of the world.
And they're going to need coalition
Yeah.
partners to be able to develop that as well. And it is in Afghanistan's interest to make sure that they are not cheated in that process.
Yeah. Yeah, and we are being cheated right now. And the government of the Taliban, who are in charge, basically, it gives free rein to the Chinese and Iranians and Pakistanis and Russians to take whatever they can to get out. There are instances where they just blow up mountains with explosives and fill the trucks with just raw stones,
the ore and so forth. It's there,
and then just take them to through different routes from Pakistan to China, where they get processed. Unfortunately, they do whatever they can in the interim until their plan is basically to solidify the Taliban government. When that government is solidified, then basically Afghanistan will be an added extension of the Chinese factories, and for the resources that Afghanistan has, they're planning to use them, of course, with the help of Iranians and Pakistanis.
Which is why there has to be a regime change. You have to have people in there like you who understand that when you do build those coalitions, because yes, you're going to need some foreign expertise and so forth in order to do some of these developments. But not only should the resources be extracted, but there should also be the industrial infrastructure in order to at least do part of the processing and building from those resources before exports occur. Otherwise, you end up with nowhere close to the amount of, let's see, what did they used to call it in business? Conversion benefit. They call them conversion costs, but there's also a benefit to conversion. And the closer to home those conversions, those industrial, those business, those product conversions occur, the better it is for Afghanistan.
Absolutely. And of course, hopefully this time around, there would not be much violence. The expectation that Afghans have is from the People's Uprising is that when Afghans throughout the country, men and women, millions of Afghans, if they come out on the streets of Kabul and Kandahar and different provinces, that these number of fighters that the Taliban have, 50, 60, 70,000 fighters, they wouldn't be able to withstand the millions of Afghans when they come out, because Afghans have proven when they move with millions of men and women, I mean, nobody will be able to resist them, and the Taliban will fall quickly. And even if they use arms, I don't think they would dare to use guns against the people of Afghanistan in that circumstance. And if they do, or the hope and expectation is that the international community, particularly the West, would stand on the side of the people of Afghanistan against this terrorist regime.
Well, it's happened before. I mean, you've heard of Congressman Brady as well as anybody has. We'll have to see. I'm upset for the Afghan people that they would have to go through that, because it would not be bloodless. But sometimes you're out of choices.
And the move that was in Congress prior to the election by some of the Republican Congress people to make sure that Taliban are considered as a terrorist or recognized as a terrorist group. What do you expect now that the House and Senate and administration is with Republicans?
The entire terrorist watch list is going to change significantly. I don't know if you saw it. There was actually a fairly recent news blurb about the fact that some pro-life organizations were listed as terrorist organizations in teaching material that was being used in the U.S. Army. And people have gone absolutely nuts over that. So yes, that terrorism list is going to change significantly, and it's going to be watched carefully. And I strongly believe that ISIS-K and the Taliban and perhaps even some other fringe organizations in Pakistan and Afghanistan will their positions on that list will change dramatically.
Yeah. Well, with that, that's very hopeful sign. So it's good to hear. We are awaiting that decision when one of the most important democracy in the world, the United States, cuts off all their ties and relationship with the Taliban, and then stand on the side of the Afghan people and support the Afghan people's demand to have women's rights, to have education for women, and to have democracy, basically have the right to vote. We're eagerly awaiting that.
Appeasing bullies never works. And frankly, the Taliban is a bully organization. Like you just said, you're talking, what, 60, 70,000 people that are being able to hold over the heads of millions of Afghanis. It's hard to watch. It really is.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being with us. It was a very interesting conversation. Really enjoyed it. Maybe if you have any messages to the American public, given now that the election is over and done, we're looking forward to a new administration. If you have any message to the new administration, the officials there, and how would you advise them to look into Afghanistan and the type of policy that they need to consider, and also if you have any words to your Afghan friends.
It's clear that for Americans, this election was a repudiation of the irrelevant. And when I say irrelevant, I'm talking about a lot of issues that are important to minority elements that have never been a problem of not having rights or capabilities or opportunities, but instead to have an agenda for others that were clearly resisting it. So I think that we're headed back toward seriousness in the dealings that the United States has with the rest of the world. And there's certainly been, I mean, in just less than a week, the headlines on various things that have changed, and you can take some of it with a grain of salt, but there are definitely folks throughout the world that are looking at, this is an old poker reference, their whole card a little bit differently these days. And of course, the change in the administration doesn't even take place until January 20th. I think those are good signs. I think that they bode well literally across the face of the world, and that certainly includes Afghanistan. This list that you had mentioned, once that changes, I think that the Afghan people will start to feel again that they have someone who might not send troops back, but is at least in their corner and is more than willing to watch and listen. And if they see those sparks of independence start to happen again, to support them in that. I mean, after all, we're doing it with Ukraine, and we should, and we're doing it with Israel, and we should, and we are willing to support the spark and to fan the flame of people looking for freedom all over the world. And Afghans, please let us know if we can help you to fan that flame where you live.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it would be a great day, moment of celebration and victory when millions of women of Afghanistan are freed. I think that would be a major success story for the new administration if they help facilitate that, or to stand on a corner with Afghan women and Afghans in general. So we appreciate
they're beautiful
that.
people, Sadiq, and you just can't deny that. You'd love to see people like that have all of the opportunity to contribute to the world that everybody else does.
Yes. Definitely we'll do that. And great things are ahead of us. Of course, there are threats, there are dangers, but I'm sure now we are in a better place, hopefully with the new administration, with the new leadership, that logical policies and policies that are advancing the interest of the U.S. and interest of Afghanistan, interest of the world, is being implemented. So thank you very much, Shane, for being with me. It was a good conversation. Hopefully, we'll have you again in the future. This is the first of the episode of Real Talks with Amini. We will have this as a platform to speak with all of our non-Afghan friends and allies in the United States and around the world to talk about Afghanistan and to talk about our shared perspectives of the situation in Afghanistan and how do we together think there could be a solution and a way forward for Afghanistan. So thank you very much for being with us in this program and looking forward to having you in future programs. Thank you very much.
Sadiq. I am looking forward to your voice being out there.
Thank you very much. God bless you, Shane. God bless the United States. God bless Afghanistan, and God bless our world. Thank you.
You too, Sadiq.